On November 5th, 1911, a train from New York pulls into Jacksonville's Union Depot, and Sidney Olcott, director of the Kalem Company's Florida troupe, steps onto the platform. It's Olcott's fourth trip to the city.
In the 3 years since his initial arrival, Jacksonville has finished building its first skyscrapers. And the architect behind two of them, Henry David Clutho, is midway through building his masterpiece, the St. James Building, which will one day be Jacksonville's City Hall.
In 1911, the city's also now home to at least 2 dedicated motion picture theaters on Forsyth Street, where audiences can take in some of the 70-plus films Kalem's already made locally.
Olcott already knows what the focus of this new season will be: the Civil War.
We'll make a great many war pictures during the present season. We have a complete set of uniforms of all ranks which will be here in a few days. The lot includes about 300 in all. When these arrive, we will begin on these scenes.
And Kalem does just that, but not with Olcott or Kalem leading lady and primary screenwriter Jean Gaultier. They're about to be called away to star in an ambitious set of films shot in the Middle East.
Instead, the studio sends Kenyon Buell, a lawyer-turned-actor who'd been part of the Florida troupe for its first 2 seasons before a stint at the company's California studio. Buell, who had already filled in for Olcott in Jacksonville, is the obvious choice to lead the new Florida outfit, and he leads them into battle.
I'm Brendan Rivers.
I'm Tammy Cherry.
And this is Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media.
This is the second half of our story about the Kalem Company and Jacksonville's brief but exciting time as the winter film capital of the world. If you haven't heard the first episode, we highly recommend you do before continuing with this one. Kalem started fighting the Civil War before ever coming to Jacksonville.
In 1907, almost a full year before taking their first train south, Olcott and Gaultier shot The Days of 61 together in New Jersey. This sentimental tale of an old woman who dreams of her youthful romance with a brave Union soldier is widely considered the first Civil War film ever made. Those superlatives are tricky to verify in early cinema.
It was, however, definitely not the first war drama, a genre popular in both novels and theatrical productions of the day.
I think it's important to point out that the Civil War was just a little over 40 years removed from the time in which these productions are being shot and made. We are, in our current moment, as far away from the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War era as these filmmakers were from the American Civil War.
David Morton is a lecturer in film and history at the University of Central Florida. He's written extensively about the industry in Jacksonville. His forthcoming book is Motion Picture Paradise, a history of Florida's film and television industry.
And he says it's not surprising that Kalem made 2 war dramas here in its first season. It was a former Confederate state, and the 50th anniversary of the war was fast approaching.
But in March 1909, when they released The Old Soldier Story, in which an aged veteran recalls his exploits as a rebel spy, reviewers in moving picture world immediately noticed something different about Kalem's approach.
Up to this point, Civil War films have generally been told from a northern point of view. But Kalem co-founder Frank Marion, a Pennsylvania native raised in New York, thinks there's a market for a southern perspective. And it turns out he's right.
In May of 1909, the Florida Company launches one of Kalem's most successful projects to date, and perhaps the first film series, The Girl Spy, written by none other than Jean Gaultier.
Where she plays a Southern belle who ends up disguising herself as a Union soldier and infiltrating behind Union lines to basically do reconnaissance for the Confederacy. This is a very loosely adapted telling of a real-life Confederate spy by the name of Belle Boyd.
The Girl Spy is an immediate hit. Within 2 weeks, it's showing in Jacksonville at Frank Krau's Bijou Theater on Ashley Street, which caters to Black audiences in La Villa.
The Girl Spy runs there as part of a Sunday double feature with another locally made Kalem film, The Northern Schoolmaster, a Reconstruction-era drama that includes the first known film depiction of the Ku Klux Klan.
Kalem makes one more Civil War film in 1909, after the company has returned north for the summer. Unlike the Florida-based pictures, The Escape from Andersonville is a decidedly pro-Union film, depicting a daring escape from the Confederacy's most notorious prison camp, where nearly 13,000 Northern soldiers died of starvation or disease.
Kalem's decision to tell this story may have been influenced by the controversy over a monument being raised to Captain Henry Wirtz, the commandant of Andersonville, who had been executed as a war criminal. It's also possible that while in Jacksonville, the Kalemites heard about the day in April 1865 when 2,000 Andersonville survivors showed up at the western edge of town after walking 20 miles from Baldwin, where they'd been released.
Moving Picture World praises Escape from Andersonville for its factual portrayal of soldiers' suffering. But the Southern response to the film isn't great. Here's the New Orleans Statesman.
No such Andersonville has existed, as is the one described in the picture show story. Northern partisans have endeavored to paint such a place in such conditions in order to justify the infamy of the hanging of Major Wirtz. But in that way, they have utterly failed, for the truth of history has annihilated their malevolent machinations.
The writer goes on to say the picture demonstrates the need for greater censorship of films. Even the New York Dramatic Mirror took note of the criticisms being leveled at the company.
Matters of religion, politics, or race feeling are dangerous to meddle with. The Kalem Company found this out in the manner of one or two Southern pictures in which the Negro question was not handled with discretion.
It's not clear what specifically the Mirror is referring to. It could have been the depiction of the KKK as antagonists in The Northern Schoolmaster, or perhaps it was the titular heroine of the Octoroon, who defies the 19th century literary trope of the tragic mulatta, a biracial character doomed by her inability to fit into black or white society, by getting a happy ending with a lover whose race isn't made clear.
But weighing all the criticism against the success of The Girl Spy, Kalem decides to double down on pro-Southern war pictures. In their second season in Jacksonville, the Kalemites make 30 films, 7 of which are war dramas, including 3 more Girl Spy films. In their third season across the winter of 1910 to 1911, they make 2 final Girl Spy adventures, plus 9 more Civil War pictures. And the response is glowing.
These pictures were all taken in the South, often on or near the very theater of war. They give credit to the bravery and the indomitable spirit of the South, and for that reason are welcome North and South. More welcome even in the North. Was such a thing possible? For the gallantry of the Southern armies is justly looked upon as a national glory to be shared by all sections. In this way, the Kalem pictures have a splendid educational value, as they help the newer generations forget the bitterness and only remember the common glories of that heroic epic.
That even the New York-based Moving Picture World, whose editor is a Scotsman, adopts this tone, illustrates the pervasiveness of the Lost Cause mythology, which downplays the role of slavery as a cause of the Civil War and revels in the heroism of the conflict. Although Lost Cause mythology originated shortly after the war in accounts by former rebels, it was picked up by social organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and then legitimized by a revisionist historical movement called the Dunning School.
Named after Columbia professor William Archibald Dunning, a founding member of the American Historical Association, the Dunning School promotes the belief that Reconstruction was doomed to failure due to what he described as the inherently inferior nature of black people.
As they graduate and become professors themselves, Dunning's students help spread his Lost Cause mythology to universities across the country. And the North is ready to listen.
Considering the fact that we're also at a point where Jim Crow is rising and segregation is being imposed not just in the American South, but roughly about half the states in the U.S. had legal segregation ordinances, while emerging redlining policies certainly were also being applied in urban environments and centers as well, led a more sympathetic view to that so-called Southern perspective, even in northern communities.
So, Kalem's Civil War films, along with other popular media, are playing a role in perpetuating the lost cause myth of the Civil War. Eventually, Kalem will play an even more direct role. More on that after the break.
Hi, I'm Ann Schindler. I'm the host of First Coast Connect, an hour-long call-in program featuring local newsmakers, community leaders, artists, and events across Northeast Florida. We're also a podcast. If you missed the broadcast or want daily news dropped right into your podcast app, subscribe now so you don't miss a show. The link to subscribe is in the show notes. Join the conversation.
By the time Buell arrives in Jacksonville, 50 years and 8 months after Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, the Civil War is big business in film. Buell comes prepared for the season, bringing 4 pieces of field artillery to add realism and reassurances that Kalem plans to continue its pro-Southern stance.
In fact, one of the first things he does after settling his new troop in at Roseland is give an interview, letting the locals know that he and his people are fellow travelers.
When seen by a representative of the Times Union at the headquarters of the company in Fairfield yesterday afternoon, Mr. Buell was enthusiastic regarding the work. The company, he said, has a majority of Southerners in it, he himself being one. In this connection, Mr. Buell stated that Southern stockholders were also in the majority.
It's a point Buell might have just been stretching in service of public relations. According to the New York Times, Kalem co-founder Samuel Long, a Tennessee native, did own 40% of the company's shares when he passed away a few years later, but Northerner Frank Marion owned the rest.
As for Buell, he is in fact a Southerner, having been born in the small town of Springfield, Kentucky. But of the 10 other people listed in his company, half are from Europe and the northeastern United States.
Leading man Guy Coombs, memorably described by Motion Picture Magazine as tall, athletic, studious, and democratic enough to eat pie on a rail fence, was born in Washington, D.C., just under the Mason-Dixon line. And the company's ingenue, 20-year-old Miriam Cooper, who would one day play an era-defining Southern belle in The Birth of a Nation, was from Baltimore.
Cooper, whose only prior acting experience was as an extra in one of D.W. Griffith's biograph pictures, had left her single mother and 4 siblings in a tenement in Little Italy when Frank Marion offered her $35 a week to join the Kalemites at Roseland. Years later, she reflects on this first trip away from home in her memoir.
From my bedroom window, I could look out on lush, green growth and see the big steamers going up and down the St. Johns River. It was beautiful, and I loved it, but at the same time, I was so homesick that I cried myself to sleep many a night.
Cooper remembers this season as a whirlwind, with the crew producing a single-reel war picture every week, a pace so rapid that the films run together in her mind. Like Gantier before her, Cooper does her own stunts. She also frequently plays roles where the heroine disguises herself as a boy.
For the drummer girl of Vicksburg, where her character takes her dead brother's place in a Confederate regiment, Cooper spends weeks learning to play drums, even though no one will hear them in the finished film.
Off-screen, Cooper keeps busy learning to ride horses from the locals or playing with pets given to her by the cast and crew.
Hal Clements gave me a dog, and on St. Valentine's Day, one of the men gave me a kitten. How I got the pet alligator, I don't remember. He was just a little one, only 8 inches long. Hal nailed a box together for him to live in, put a pan of water in it, some river sand, and a piece of screen on top. In the evenings, we would all sit around watching the dog and cat chase the alligator. And that was what glamorous movie stars did in 1912.
Cooper isn't the only one to wind up with a reptilian companion. The next year, the Florida troop sends a 15-inch alligator to company treasurer William Wright, who promptly names it Kalem. Not that it ever responded to the name.
The season isn't all reptiles and roses. While on the way to film for the Battle of Pottsburg Creek, Buell and his crew are maneuvering around several moored rafts of logs when their boat strikes a piling and starts taking water. They end up being saved by a passing launch. And the weather is bad, putting the company several weeks behind schedule.
In May, the Kalemites have to take time to move from Roseland to a spacious private boarding house that they dub Kalem House. And occasionally, the locals cause unintended production delays, like when Buell tries to put together a suitably scruffy group of extras. Here's the story from the Kalem Calendar, the company's promotional magazine.
With infinite care, he had the docks of Jacksonville searched for character types and collected for his first day's work the finest lot of unkempt and unshaven soldiers that ever graced a wartime battlefield. Elated with the realism he had secured with his motley crew, he paid them off at the finish of the day's work with instructions that they report the following morning for additional scenes, which would complete the production. To Mr. Buell's astonishment and chagrin, when his soldiers appeared the next day, practically every man had been shaven and shorn and stood resplendent before him.
Despite these issues, Buell and his team managed to make 16 Civil War pictures, plus at least 2 films on unrelated topics, many of them starring Miriam Cooper.
Recently, I read in the moving picture world of 1912 some of the synopses of Kalem films. They called me plucky, brave, intrepid, and courageous. I ran trains, shot cannons, burned bridges, spied, all for the Confederates. I don't see how the Yankees won the war.
By the time the Florida Company gets back to New York in June 1912, the advertisements Kalem runs with a map of its various studio locations represents Jacksonville with an illustration of Civil War soldiers firing a cannon.
In October of that year, Buell, Cooper, and Coombs returned with an expanded crew for Kalem's 5th season in Florida. On the way south, they stop in Virginia to do location shoots for Shenandoah, a Civil War epic based on a wildly popular Bronson Howard play about the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864. But almost as soon as they arrive in Jacksonville, the Kalemites find themselves in the middle of an entirely different kind of battle.
On October 28th, the streetcar operators of the Jacksonville Traction Company strike after 25 of their men were fired for joining a union. In a city where more than 7,000 suburban residents use the streetcars to commute downtown for work, the strike causes a huge disruption to local business.
Things escalate when the company hires strikebreakers, setting off violent confrontations that prompt the mayor to call in the state militia. For just over 3 weeks, the city teeters on the verge of chaos, and Kalem's presence doesn't exactly help.
One night, the citizens were startled by a series of explosions, accompanied by an unusual illumination of the sky, which gave rise to fears that new depredations were being perpetrated by the strikers. It developed that Mr. Kenyon Buell, director of the Kalem Company, was taking some spectacular military scenes with the aid of calcium bombs.
The explosions may have been for the opening scenes of Shenandoah, which begins with a distant view of the guns at Fort Sumter. It's certain that Buell makes the most of the strike while it lasts, hiring almost all of the more than 200 striking motormen and conductors as extras for the film's battle scenes.
Kalem releases Shenandoah on July 4th, 1913, potentially an awkward date choice if the film were yet another pro-Southern story. Shenandoah does feature a Southern love interest, but its focus is on a Union hero. In fact, in what seems an abrupt about-face, all 9 of Kalem's Civil War films that season have Union heroes. Later, William Wright would reflect on the shift.
Well, we made Confederate pictures, and you may remember they were a hit until we began to be flooded with letters from Grant Army men. I recall particularly one writer who relieved his mind by inquiring, "Does the Kalem Company realize that the Union Army sometimes won a battle in the Civil War?"
At this point, war dramas no longer dominate the output of Kalem's Jacksonville branch, partly because of its expansion to include 2 additional companies. This allows them to work on 3 projects simultaneously and combine forces into one mammoth company for more epic films. Kalem produces over 40 pictures in Jacksonville that season, and the company's promotional publication, the Kalem Calendar, declares the Jacksonville studio one of the largest in the world.
By December of 1913, the company has fully pivoted to the northern perspective. That month, Kalem releases an adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the 6th film version of the novel by sometimes Mandarin resident Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Florida metropolis credits the production to Buell's assistant director Storm Boyd, who, within a few years, will be managing the whole local studio.
You wouldn't pick this as the place to stage Uncle Tom's Cabin, would you? Well, Storm Boyd of the Kalem Company did it. He discovered that the gleaming of white sand of the Florida beaches made better snow for movie purposes than the clouds themselves could produce. He fenced in a section of the St. Johns River, bought 5 tons of ice, and the setting for Eliza's dramatic getaway from the bloodhounds was complete. Those chunks of ice were somewhat smaller before the film was complete, and the leading lady testified that the water was somewhat colder, but the production was particularly realistic.
One of the stars of the film is Miriam Cooper, The Kalem calendar praises Cooper for her willingness to be made up with burnt cork in blackface for her role as Topsy.
Around New Year's 1914, Kalem enters a lease on a new tract of land next to their current property. They build a permanent studio there, equipped with a glass roof and lit by Cooper Hewitt lights, the latest in theatrical lighting, which by themselves cost almost $20,000, more than $500,000 today. Kalem, whose brand has been built on outdoor settings, wants to make pictures in any kind of weather, even at night.
On March 28th, a few hundred Jacksons and film people, including Kalem President Samuel Long and his wife, gather to celebrate the new studio. The Metropolis describes the event as pure old Hollywood glamour.
The grounds extending for a block on Talleyrand Avenue before the studio was reached scintillated with lights from Japanese lanterns hanging in the trees and from electric bulbs of various hues and colors stretching along the roadway. The spacious greens facing the studio on the river and in the rear of the studio on Talleyrand Avenue presented a spectacle akin almost to a fairyland because of the elaborate and painstaking decorations. The building itself was decorated almost beyond description.
The opening of the Kalem studio is far from the largest celebration Jacksonville hosts that year. In May, tens of thousands of people descend upon the city for the 24th annual Confederate Veterans Reunion. The event is akin to a Super Bowl for the lost cause. Mayor Van Swearingen even declares a 3-day citywide holiday so workers can attend what he refers to as the greatest convention or gathering in the history of the city.
Local committees spend months planning the festivities and, crucially, fundraising. Jacksonville's film community steps up to help, and Kalem bands together with 3 other studios, Lubin's, Edison's, and former Kalemite Sidney Olcott's, to shoot a pair of benefit films. The Florida Metropolis covered the collaboration.
After discussing the project very thoroughly, it was decided to have 2 pictures made, one representing a wartime scene and the other of a local nature with Jacksonville people figuring prominently in the leading roles. The pictures will first be shown in local theaters for several days and then circulated throughout the South. The entire proceeds from all exhibitions of the pictures will be given to the Confederate Reunion Fund.
Kalem mostly works on the picture focusing on local society. In early April, they shoot a massive cabaret scene for it in the new studio, featuring well-known socialites from families like the Barnetts, Cohens, and LaEngles, demonstrating the latest dance steps. The full Jacksonville reel, including footage of the local police and fire departments, debuts to record crowds at the Prince Theater.
That summer, Kalem releases The Old Army Coat, which revolves around an inheritance left by an old Confederate veteran and includes footage from the reunion itself.
Kalem makes its last 2 Civil War dramas in 1915. Guy Coombs, who had repeatedly played Confederate officers 3 years ago, stars in the final Jacksonville production, Rivals, as a Union-sympathizing plantation owner who joins the federal forces.
The other film, Railroad Raiders of '62, repackages footage from a picture of the same name shot in Florida by Sidney Olcott in 1911.
If recycling film sounds like a sign of trouble, it is. For many reasons, 1915 will be a rough year for Kalem. More on that after the break.
Unlock the secrets of navigating the healthcare system with me, Dr. Joe Servin, on what's health got to do with it. I demystify medical complexities and share expert insights to help you stay healthy and informed. New episodes drop every Saturday. Tune in anytime on your favorite platform and take control of your health journey.
1915 is the beginning of the end for Kalem. And that end has its seeds in Kalem's beginnings and its relationship with Thomas Edison.
Edison was famously litigious and frequently sued over patent claims, including those related to his moving picture business. It helped him protect his inventions and profits, and had the added benefit of eliminating competition. Rather than continue to waste resources battling Edison in court, in 1908 several of his major competitors, including Kalem, joined him in an organization called the Motion Picture Patents Company.
Eventually known as the Edison Trust, the MPPC was built on agreements between film exchanges, theaters, and the Eastman Kodak Company. one of the world's major film and camera manufacturers, that allowed it to control every element of production and distribution. Simply put, it was a monopoly, and an extremely profitable one.
But on October 1st, 1915, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the Edison Trust violated the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and ordered its dissolution. Here's Professor David Morton again.
With losing access to the resources of the MPPC, what Kalem also loses is access to the legal protections that came along with these film productions, access to the film processing labs, which were still primarily based in the greater New York area, and also a loss of access to the distribution networks that the MPPC had managed to cultivate.
Losing support from the Edison Trust is a blow to Kalem, which is already reeling from the death of its president, Samuel Long. Long suddenly died of typhoid in July at the age of 40. He served as the company's president since its founding, overseeing both the commercial and technical sides of the business. Frank Marion takes over his office, with William Wright as secretary and treasurer.
The world is also changing around Kalem, with 1915 marking the beginning of the feature film era. Edison Trust companies, including Kalem, initially produced one-reel films, which lasted between 10 and 16 minutes. Over the years, Kalem experimented with longer films, including Olcott and Gantier's 1912 biblical epic From the Manger to the Cross, which clocked in at a whopping 5 reels. But the majority of their films remained shorts. And then D.W. Griffith happens.
Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which premiered at the beginning of the year and starred former Kalem actress Miriam Cooper, is notable for 2 things: its blatant racism and its 3-hour runtime. The film proved that feature-length films were viable and helped establish an appetite for them among American audiences.
Despite the wild popularity of Birth of a Nation, which is the highest-grossing film of the year, Kalem fails to recognize the growing public demand for feature films. In fact, in August, Wright comes out in staunch support of 1, 2, and 3-reel pictures in the moving picture world.
We believe that a certain percentage of the trade has gone to extremes on so-called features, many of them, in fact the majority, of questionable value. And, as we've repeatedly said before, we think it is only a question of time when the enormous majority of exhibitors will go back to the old program, and no subject will be run where the length is greater than 4 reels.
At that time in Jacksonville, the real estate and construction boom that followed the destruction of most of the city in the Great Fire of 1901 has finally slowed. When hostilities break out in Europe in August 1914, markets for the city's major exports, naval stores, fertilizer, and lumber are abruptly cut off, plunging the city into a major recession. Conditions only worsened in 1915, when 2 banks and an insurance company fail and rental agents estimate that 60% of downtown office space is vacant.
That August, in order to drive subscriptions to the city's afternoon paper during the slump, Florida Metropolis circulation manager Frank Beto launches an ambitious promotional campaign. The paper offers $100 in gold for the best screenplay for a motion picture, with the only real guidelines being that the film has to be 2 reels long and offer roles for 5 local women who will be chosen by popular vote. The film is to be produced by Kalem, who will select the winning story.
In early September, the Metropolis announces the winner, a recent Duval High School graduate named M.G. Sable. His story, The Money Gulf, is about a young woman who discovers on her wedding day that her groom owns a gambling den. And it offers plenty of bridesmaid roles for the winning ladies: Irene Miller, Jessie Ruth Snow, Gladys Thornton, Mary Lee House, and Marie Bain. The young women sailed to New York in early October for a 2-week stay at the Vanderbilt Hotel. Kalem fills them boarding at the docks, but the majority of the picture is shot in New York.
The Money Gulf debuts in Jacksonville in December. The 5 ladies appear together at the Arcade Theater to introduce the film at its final showing.
2 weeks before they take the stage, Robert Vignola, a veteran of Kalem's Florida troupe who's just arrived from New Jersey to take Buell's place, receives some shocking news. Here's the Florida Metropolis.
Notice has been received by the Kalem Company's managers here that they must close the studio on Talleyrand Avenue within 2 weeks and the members of the company be disbanded. When asked the reason why the New York office had taken these steps, local manager Vignola said the officials of the company had not notified the local office of their reasons, but that the studio was to be closed temporarily.
By the time Kalem's Jacksonville studio reopens in January of 1916, Wright is more convinced than ever that the fad of long films is on the wane. The focus for the Florida troupe will now be single-reel comedies. To that end, Kalem hires Rose Melville, a theatrical actress who's known for playing a country bumpkin called Sis Hopkins, and creates an entire series around her.
Melville can be spotted around town in character, decked out in her signature Pippi Longstocking braids and gingham pinafore. Accustomed to the theater, Melville finds the transition to film challenging and jokes about losing 10 pounds from all the running around. She also finds herself unnerved at having the whole world as a stage.
The first day outdoors found me more thoroughly frightened than I was on the night I first stepped out of the wings to face a Broadway audience. Just think of walking across the main thoroughfare of the thriving city of Jacksonville in full regalia and before a large crowd. I can assure you I felt like the greatest show on earth.
The first Sis Hopkins comedy, A Leap Year's Wooing, debuts in March. Sis appears as a kitchen maid who's inspired to look for a lover of her own after seeing how attentive her mistress's sweetheart is. They cast 2 local actors, Arthur Albertson and Mary Kennedy. Albertson, born in Waycross, had been a clerk at Barnett Bank before joining Kalem in 1914. Kennedy, also originally from Georgia, is 19 years old and a well-known society belle who had started appearing in Kalem films the previous year. Local papers describe her as gifted with that indefinable magnet, personality.
Despite a massive advertising campaign by Kalem, the first Sis Hopkins film receives only modest reviews. But the troupe, under the direction of former circus performer Robert Ellis, churns out 21 more installments over the next few months. Kennedy appears in about half of them before leaving for New York to pursue a career on the stage. Albertson sticks it out for the whole run.
Kalem may have been planning for the series to continue indefinitely. In early April, there were reports of extending Melville's contract. But by mid-month, Moving Picture World is reporting the company has temporarily curtailed activities at the Jacksonville studio, and shortly thereafter, the series concludes.
Production would resume, but the troupe eventually shifts from comedies to action thrillers. The new star, daredevil George Larkin, arrives from New York in early September, and in October, the first of the new series, Grant, Police Reporter, lands in theaters. Supposedly based on the average adventures encountered by news reporters on the crime beat, the pictures are more notable for their stunts than their plots. Here's the Moving Picture World.
One of the thrilling scenes in the code letter calls on Larkin to let himself down hand over hand on the rope of a painter's scaffold from the roof of a skyscraper. When he is in midair, the other rope supporting the scaffold is cut, and Larkin swings through the air, escaping death by grabbing the rail of a fire ladder. The scene was staged in the heart of the business section of Jacksonville and caused a temporary suspension of business activity.
By January of 1917, more than 1,000 actors and 30 film companies are reportedly working in Jacksonville on a regular or semi-regular basis. Filmmakers are also working in other parts of the state, including the Miami and Tampa areas.
Taking notice, the Cleveland Leader sends a special correspondent to write about this movie, Explosion.
Florida is just naturally all broken out with movies. The whirring of cameras resounds over the state like the humming of locusts, and the wails of directors when the sun goes under a cloud fairly rattles the windows for miles around. It is an empty train indeed that brings no star and her cordage to Jax, as the people who live in Jacksonville call it, and Jax takes good care of them too.
Some of that care is due to the pro-movie policies of Jet Bowden. Bowden, who had surprised the city by running for mayor again 14 years after first holding the position, defeated incumbent Van Swearingen in a runoff and took office in 1915.
He's pro not just business, but also this sort of very lively bohemian atmosphere that is the perfect environment for, well, a film industry or for creative types. That's part of his vision for the city at large.
Once in office, Bowden joins the Board of Trade in an aggressive campaign to attract film production companies to Jacksonville to help restore business confidence and create new jobs.
But by the end of 1916, Bowden is facing a stiff primary challenge. 31-year-old lawyer John Welburn Martin brings together a coalition of reform interests, including churches, prohibitionists, and anti-vice crusaders, who support his campaign for mayor. On the other side, Mayor Bowden gets near unanimous support from the local film studios, who had invested nearly $10 million into the city by this point.
On February 6, 1917, Martin wins the mayoral primary by about 800 votes before running unopposed in the general election that summer.
But because the film studios had so closely aligned themselves with Bowden, and because of the fact that they had contributed tens of thousands of dollars to the Bowden campaign, when Martin ultimately wins on this anti-vice platform, in the long run, ultimately, he also then turns his ire toward film producers and is not nearly the same kind of cooperative state that had existed just even a couple years before.
This is the moment that's often cited as the death knell for Jacksonville's cinematic dreams. But for Kalem, the end had already come.
In late December 1916, Moving Picture World runs a story on a planned addition to Kalem's studio in Glendale, California. Storm Boyd, who once substituted sand for snow in the Jacksonville production of Uncle Tom's Cabin, is tapped to manage the new location, where the Florida troupe is scheduled to move in early spring.
Ellis and his crew work overtime preparing for the move, turning out an average of 2 thrillers a week before their departure on St. Patrick's Day 1917. The March 17th issue of the Florida Metropolis includes a farewell from the Kalemites.
In an open letter to the people of Jacksonville, director Bob Ellis and his company thank them for their cooperation and goodwill during the company's stay here, and state that in leaving this city they do so not according to their own wishes, but upon orders from the powers that be, whom have seen fit to close the local studio, concentrating the players in their West Coast studios.
Though the plan is for the company to travel to New York and then on to California to continue the Grant Police Reporter series, that never happens. Within 3 months, all of the players have either left Kalem or left pictures altogether. One former Kalemite writes back to say he's now selling cotton goods and that when he makes his pile, he'll return to dear old Jack's to live.
The Sign of the Scarf, the last of 29 episodes of Grant Police Reporter, hits theaters on November 3, 1917. The last release from Kalem's Jacksonville studio. Just over a year later, Kalem itself ceases to exist when the company is absorbed into Vitagraph, which becomes part of Warner Brothers Pictures in 1925.
Many of Kalem's directors and stars go on to have long careers with other companies. Local girl Mary Kennedy, who once played ingenues for Sis Hopkins, stars in several more pictures, one of them directed by Sidney Olcott, before becoming a successful playwright.
And the Kalem Studios' expensive lighting system, the pride of the facility they built in 1914, finds a new home on Main Street, between 8th and 9th at the studio run by architect Henry David Clutho. But that's another story.
This is Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media. Thanks for listening. I'm Brendan Rivers.
And I'm Tammy Cherry.
A big thanks to Jennifer Gray and her colleagues at Florida State College at Jacksonville, whose research made this podcast possible. And to our editor at WJCT Public Media, Jessica Palumbo.
If you're interested in learning more about the River City's past, check out FSCJ's History of Jacksonville course.
If you'd like to learn more about local film history, take a look at the show notes at wjct.org/bygonejacks, where you can find links to the sources we used and more.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review. Thanks for listening.